The night Michael Jackson's voice finally broke was not in a rehearsal room, but in front of thousands of people who had paid to hear perfection. When that high note cracked in the middle of the song, the arena screamed even louder. Almost no one in that room realized they had just heard his body say something his team had been afraid to put into words. The night was not allowed to go wrong. Cameras were hidden in the dark like quiet judges, sponsors sat in polished VIP seats, and somewhere in the control truck outside, a red light was ready to record every second as proof that Michael Jackson was still untouchable. Thousands of people pressed toward the stage, holding up phones and handmade signs, certain they were about to watch perfection walk out under the lights one more time. Backstage, it did not feel like perfection. In the narrow hallway that led to the stage, Michael stood with a paper cup in his hand, the warm liquid inside already gone. His throat burned in a way he did not say out loud. The sound engineer had watched him clear his throat too many times during sound check. The doctor who had flown in for the tour had spoken in a low, careful voice in the dressing room, saying words like inflamed, overworked, and you need real rest, not just a day. He had listened, he had nodded. Then he had looked at the monitor on the wall where the crowd was already taking their seats and asked one question. Are they here already? The answer was obvious. You could hear it in the low roar rising through the concrete. People had saved money, traded shifts, begged parents, traveled from other cities just to be inside this building. Out in the stands, a father was telling his son, "You are about to see the greatest performer who ever lived." There was no space in that sentence for cancellations or weakness. The doctor had suggested a shorter set. The vocal coach had suggested cutting the hardest song. Someone from management had quietly mentioned the contract clause and what would happen if he pulled out this late. Numbers were spoken, penalties, headlines, rumors. Michael listened to all of it, then set the empty cup down on the dressing room table and said very softly, "They came to see a show." The crew watched him move through his pre-show routine with a strange kind of silence. His warm-up was shorter tonight. The scales did not float up as easily as usual. Twice, he stopped mid-note and pressed his fingers against his throat, as if he could feel the strain from the outside. But when a knock came at the door and someone called, 5 minutes, he straightened, checked his jacket in the mirror, and gave the same small nod he always gave when it was time. In the tunnel to the stage, the music director caught up to him and tried one last time. "If we drop that one song, no one will notice. We can shift into something else. It will still be huge." Michael looked at him. For a moment his eyes were tired, older than the man in the posters outside. Then the tiredness disappeared behind a soft, practiced smile. "They will notice," he said. "I will notice." The house lights went down. A wave of sound crashed over the arena as people stood up, shouting his name. From the darkness at the side of the stage, he watched the ocean of tiny lights flicker in the crowd and felt that familiar pull. Out there, he was not allowed to be sick. Out there, he was the man who never missed. He stepped into the spotlight, and the first songs unfolded like muscle memory. The choreography hit its marks. The band locked in. To everyone watching, it looked like any other triumphant night. Only he knew that every high note felt a little narrower, like walking along the edge of a roof instead of a wide hallway. Then the opening chords began for the ballad. The one song everyone waited for, the one with the high note that had carried him through years of stages and stadiums. In rehearsals, someone had suggested lowering the key. He had refused. To change, it felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. Now, as the lights dimmed to a single beam and the band settled into the intro, he stood completely still. Sweat slid down his neck. His hand tightened around the microphone. From the first row to the highest seat, people leaned forward, already holding their breath for the note they knew was coming. Inside, he felt it, a difference, a resistance. The same body that had carried him for decades was sending a quiet warning he could no longer ignore. He lifted the mic, drew in a breath, and thought, with a sudden, sharp clarity, "My voice feels different tonight." And then there was no more time left to think at all. Years before that breath on stage, before the lights and the cameras and the contracts, there was a small boy in a hot rehearsal room who learned that missing a note was not an option. The air smelled like dust and sweat and old wood. A band played the same 4 bars again and again until the sound blurred into one long demand. In the middle of it stood Michael, a microphone almost too big for his hand, watching faces that only softened when everything came out perfect. When his voice cracked as a child, no one called it beautiful. A sharp clap cut through the room. Again, someone said. If he looked tired, they reminded him how lucky he was. If he said his throat hurt, they told him it was the price of a gift. The message was simple and repeated so many times it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like law. Do not break, do not slow down, do not show it if you hurt. Those lessons followed him as the rooms got bigger. Moton 25, where the world watched him glide backwards and swore they had seen something impossible. Stadiums where the crowd was so loud you could feel the noise in your ribs. Halftime shows, world tour, nights when fireworks exploded overhead while he hit notes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human reach. People said he moved like a machine, like a figure from another planet. They did not see the ice baths, the sleepless flights, the hoarse mornings where sound barely came out until someone warmed his voice back into shape. Every tour had its small private alarms. There were mornings when he woke up and the first few notes came out thin and rough. There were days when a doctor looked into his throat and said phrases like vocal rest and swelling, and you are pushing past what your body wants. Those warnings landed softly and slid away. There was always another show, another city, another crowd already lining up outside an arena with his face plastered on the walls. Once on an earlier tour, the near disaster almost arrived. In the middle of a ballad, on a dangerous high note, his voice wavered. For a split second, it felt like the note would fall apart. Instead of stopping, he bent it, twisted it into a raw little run, let it break and reform as a new phrase. The crowd exploded. Critics later called it genius. They said he had reinvented the melody, added new emotion. No one wrote that for a heartbeat, his voice had simply been at the edge of what it could do. That praise sank deep. It taught him something dangerous. If anything goes wrong, you can turn it into art and the world will still call it planned. So when doctors worried before a tour, when managers quietly circled dates on calendars that left no real rest, when someone suggested changing a key to make a song easier, he smiled and shook his head. This was the sound people knew. This was the height they paid to hear. Lowering, it felt like admitting that he was agging, that the years had weight, that the body inside the legend had limits like anyone else. On the day of this particular concert, the conversation about cancelling was not theoretical. The doctor laid out the risk. The tour manager laid out the numbers, the headlines, the angry promoters, the disappointed fans. Michael sat and listened, his hands folded, the weight of 100 jobs and a global reputation pressing in on a single decision. What happens to everyone if we cancel? He asked quietly. The answer was long and practical and full of consequences for everyone but him. Crew, band, security, venue staff. It sounded less like an option and more like a threat. He stood up, thanked them, and went to wardrobe. He had spent a lifetime being the man who never broke character. Tonight, for the first time, his body was preparing to break it for him. The room seemed to lean toward him when the first line left his mouth. The ballad floated out over the crowd like something familiar and fragile at the same time. On the big screens, his face looked calm, eyes half closed, hand moving slowly with the rhythm. Inside his chest, each breath felt measured, borrowed. He could feel the edges of his range like the edge of a cliff under his feet. The first verse passed without breaking. The notes sat a little closer to the middle of his voice, not as bright as the recordings people had worn out over the years, but honest. The audience took that softness as emotion. They swayed, held up their phones, pressed themselves against each other, and whispered that he sounded more vulnerable than ever. No one out there knew how hard he was listening to himself, waiting for the place where the song always asked the most. In the orchestra pit, the band felt it. A guitarist shifted his weight and looked toward the musical director. Through in-ear monitors, the tiny imperfections were clear. There was a slight grain on the higher notes, a tightness on the endings. Over the talkback system, almost no one could hear the quiet warning, "He is pushing tonight. Watch that bridge." The arrangement moved on, the chords building a staircase toward the moment everyone was waiting for. That one line, that one high note that had become a signature, the kind of sound people tried to imitate in their cars and failed. Every time he had sung it before, the note had cut through the air like light. The expectation of it sat heavy on the room now, even before he opened his mouth. As the bridge approached, time seemed to slow. His hand came up to his chest for a second longer than usual. He drew in a deeper breath, feeling the stiffness along his throat, the slight burn that told the truth. Memories flashed through his mind, uninvited but sharp. Nights when that note had felt effortless, evenings when he had floated over audiences on sound alone. This did not feel like those nights. He chose anyway. Backing away was not who he had been taught to be. With the band swelling behind him, he lifted his chin, closed his eyes, and went for it. The note launched clean, bright at first, a pure line that made the crowd roar as soon as they heard it. For a moment, it felt like the old days, the sound flying up exactly where it was supposed to go. Then, halfway through, something inside his voice slipped. The tone fractured. It cracked across the middle, dropping into a raw, broken edge that tore the smoothness apart. The sound of that crack cut through the arena more sharply than any perfect note. To the fans, it felt like he had ripped open the song on purpose, like he was letting them hear something deeper and more wounded. Screams got louder. Hands flew to mouths in shock and then turned into cheers. People looked at each other with wide eyes, certain they had just witnessed some new, brilliant twist. On stage, the moment landed like a jolt in his body. It did not feel like art. It felt like a fault line. For a heartbeat, he thought the note would collapse completely. Instinct took over. Instead of pulling back, he caught the broken sound, bent it, slid it downward into a softer, trembling run. The imperfection became a new phrase. The band, trained to follow him anywhere, adjusted without missing a beat. By the time the song reached its final chorus, the crowd had decided what they believed. This was the most emotional version they had ever heard. They shouted his name, tears on their faces, convinced he had chosen to sound that exposed. He hit the last line more gently, letting the melody sit lower, hiding the strain under warmth. Applause hit him like a wave. He smiled, bowed, raised his hand in thanks. Inside, all he could hear was the exact moment his voice had snapped. When the lights dropped for the next transition and he stepped into the shadow at the side of the stage, his first words were not about the crowd. He turned to the nearest person, eyes searching, and asked in a low, unsteady voice, "You heard that, right?" In the quiet after the show, the dressing room felt smaller than usual. The roar of the crowd was still leaking through the walls, a dull, distant thunder that said the night had been a success. On the table in front of him, someone had laid out towels, water, a fresh change of clothes. No one touched them. People hovered instead, speaking in careful, bright voices about sponsors who were thrilled, about executives who wanted to talk, about the way the audience had reacted to that new twist in the big ballad. Michael sat on the edge of the couch, head slightly bowed, the stage still on his skin, sweat dried in thin lines along his jaw. The echo of the cracked note replayed in his mind again and again, a loop he could not switch off. The smiles around him felt far away, as if he were watching them through glass. Finally, he raised his head and cut through the praise with a soft question. "Tell me about that note." The room shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. A few people pretended not to understand which note he meant. The ones who did looked at each other, passing the weight of the answer back and forth in silence. For years, nobody around him had wanted to be the one who confirmed a flaw. One person stepped forward, someone who had heard his voice in empty rehearsal halls and late-night run-throughs, who knew what it sounded like when it was strong and what it sounded like when it was not. "Your voice cracked," they said. The words landed with a dull finality. No one rushed to soften them. There was no joke, no easy reassurance, just the truth hanging in the air between legend and human being. He did not explode. He did not argue. He sat back, eyes unfocused on a spot on the wall, and listened as if the statement had come from a stranger. After a long moment, he asked the other question he already knew the answer to. "Do you think they noticed?" Cut to the world outside, where the answer was already being written. Clips from the concert appeared online within hours. Fans uploaded shaky videos with excited captions. Commentators replayed the cracked note and called it raw, soulful, a new emotional choice. They said he had taken a polished classic and broken it open on purpose. To millions of people who watched through screens, the crack was not a mistake, it was a gift. Inside the camp, the conversation was different. Doctors reviewed his vocal cords. The phrase, pushed too far, appeared more than once. Rest was no longer a suggestion but a condition. Schedules were examined. Keys were discussed again, this time with less resistance. The idea that his voice was an endless resource began, very slowly, to die. For decades, his greatness had been measured in all the ways he seemed untouched by normal limits. The perfect lines, the impossible notes, the sense that he did not age the way other people did, that he belonged to some other category entirely. That one crack, on one night, pulled him back into the human world. It showed the cost of pretending that flesh and bone can behave like a machine forever. Some fans would remember that performance as the most beautiful version they ever heard. They would talk about the moment the note broke and say it felt like he was singing directly from a wound. Others, listening closely, would hear the strain under the beauty and feel a different kind of ache. Years later, people close to him would point back to that concert and say that was when his body finally spoke louder than the myth. It did not end his career. It did something quieter and more permanent. It changed how every song after sounded in his own ears. Somewhere alone with a recording of that night, he would press play and listen not as the world's icon, but as a man hearing his own limits for the first time. The crowd would hear a brave, broken note and call it planned. He would hear a question he could never entirely answer. How many times had he sounded broken on the inside, while the world swore they were hearing nothing but music?